What if I told you that for 4,000 years, the most reliable fertilizer the human race ever knew was not a powder, not a liquid, not a brightly colored bag you carry home from a garden center on a Saturday afternoon. It was a single stone, buried once in the corner of a garden, then forgotten on purpose, only to keep working season after season, decade after decade, while the world above it walked away and bought something newer, something packaged, something that did not last. By the time you finish watching this video, you will know what the stone is. You will know where to find one. You will know how to bury it. And you will know why almost no one alive today has ever heard the name of the practice that built every successful garden in human history. Before the year 1945, this is the story of that stone, and the story of the people who quietly remembered it long after the rest of us were taught to believe it never existed. I first heard about it in a place I was not expecting to hear about anything at all. A small terraced garden in the foothills of the Apennine Mountains in central Italy, 2 hours by winding mountain road from the nearest town with a name on a map. The garden belonged to a woman named Lucia Vannucci. She was 83 years old. She wore a faded blue apron with 2 pockets sewn onto the front. She walked with a slight limp that she said came from a fall on the stones of the church courtyard in 1978, and she was, without any question, the most remarkable gardener I have ever met. Her tomato plants were 6 feet tall. Her peppers were so heavy that the stems had begun to bend almost to the ground under the weight of the fruit. The leaves on her zucchini were the size of dinner plates. Her soil, when I knelt down beside one of the raised beds and pushed my hand into it, was darker and softer and warmer than any soil I had touched in years. It crumbled between my fingers like cake. It smelled like rain and wood smoke. It felt alive. I asked her what she fed it. She smiled the way old people smile when they are about to tell you something they have known their entire life and quietly assumed everyone else had forgotten. She said, "Niente, I feed it nothing." I asked her how that was possible. She did not answer with words. She walked me to the corner of the garden, past a row of fava beans and a cluster of sage, and pointed at a small mound where the soil rose perhaps half an inch above the rest of the bed. She told me her grandfather had buried something there in 1947. The year after the war ended, the year his oldest son came home from a prison camp in Germany, missing 2 fingers and most of his memory. He had buried a stone, a specific stone, from a specific kind of rock. He had buried it the same way his own grandfather had buried one in 1879. And his grandfather before him had done the same thing in a garden outside Naples in 1812. For generations of Vannucci gardeners, one stone replaced approximately every 10 years. No fertilizer purchased from a store, no compost trucked in, no bag, no bottle, no monthly trip to a garden center. Just a stone in the corner of the garden, doing what stones have been doing in gardens for 4,000 years. The stone is not magic. It is not folklore. It is not a story passed down in a vacuum by people who did not know what they were really doing. It is geology, and the geology has a name. Certain rocks formed deep inside the earth under enormous heat and tremendous pressure, contain almost every mineral that a living plant needs in order to grow. Calcium, magnesium, iron, potassium, phosphorus, manganese, zinc, boron, silica, copper, molybdenum, the full periodic table of plant nutrition, locked patiently into a single piece of solid stone, waiting to be released slowly, almost invisibly, over many years, by the rain that falls on it and the thirsty roots that grow around it. When you bury one of these stones in a garden bed, it becomes a kind of slow leak, a continuous microscopic spring of plant food that runs without ever needing to be refilled. Every drop of rain that touches the stone pulls a tiny amount of mineral into the soil around it. Every root that brushes against the stone carries away an even tinier gift of nutrition into the body of the plant it belongs to. The stone shrinks by almost nothing, almost imperceptibly, year after year, and the soil around the stone grows richer, deeper, darker, and more alive than any patch of dirt that has ever been treated with a synthetic fertilizer purchased from any aisle in any store anywhere in the world. The Sumerians knew this. Clay tablets recovered from the ruins of the ancient city of Lagash, dated by archaeologists to approximately 2,400 years before the birth of Christ, describe gardens fed by what the Sumerian scribes called, in a phrase that translates almost word for word into English, the stone that gives. The Romans knew this. Pliny the Elder, in his 37-volume Natural History, completed in the year 77 of the Common Era, devoted an entire chapter to the practice of burying mineral-rich rocks beneath the roots of olive trees and grapevines. The Andean farming communities of the high Peruvian Altiplano knew this. They were burying small mineral-rich pieces of volcanic rock under their potato fields a full 1,000 years before the first Spanish conquistador had ever set foot on the South American continent. And the Amish know this. They still know. 6 months after I left Italy, I drove to a small Amish settlement in central Pennsylvania to see if Lucia's stone was something I would find anywhere else. I sat down at the kitchen table of a man named Daniel Stoltzfus, who was the third generation of Stoltzfus men to farm the same 40-acre piece of land outside the town of Bullville. I asked him whether his family had ever used buried stones in the garden. He looked at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then he stood up, walked to the back door of his house, and waved for me to follow him outside. He took me to a vegetable garden behind his barn that was almost exactly the same size as Lucia's, perhaps 30 feet by 40 feet, planted in rows so neat they looked drawn with a ruler. He pointed at the corner nearest the well. There was a small mound there, almost exactly the same shape as the mound in Lucia's garden, 4,000 miles and 2 oceans away. Daniel told me his great-grandfather had buried the first stone in 1894. His grandfather had replaced it in 1906. His father had replaced it in 1961. Daniel himself had replaced it in 2003 and would replace it again. He expected sometime around 2028 the stone in the corner of his garden had been working continuously, in some form, for 131 years. He had never bought a bag of fertilizer in his entire life. Neither had his father. Neither had his grandfather. Neither had his great-grandfather. 4 generations of Stoltzfus men, growing food on the same 40 acres of Pennsylvania soil, feeding the same family, the same neighbors, the same Amish community, with nothing but a stone in the corner of the garden and the rain that falls on Belleville every spring. I asked him if he knew what kind of stone it was. He nodded. He told me the name in the old German dialect his grandfather had taught him. Then he translated it into English. He called it the heart rock, because it sits in the center of the garden, he said, and it keeps the garden alive. So the question becomes obvious. If this works, if it has worked for 4,000 years, if it is documented in 3 different ancient civilizations, and still being practiced today by Italian grandmothers and Amish farmers on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean, why does almost no one in the modern world know about it? The answer is not a single villain. The answer is not a conspiracy in the simple sense of the word. The answer is something quieter and, in some ways, much sadder than a conspiracy. It is a slow forgetting, the kind of forgetting that happens when something does not fit the story a culture has decided to tell about itself. In the years immediately after the Second World War, the chemical industries that had built explosives, synthetic compounds, and ammunition components for the war effort needed something new to sell. They had built enormous factories. They had hired enormous workforces. They had developed industrial processes that could synthesize nitrogen out of the air itself. And when the war ended, all of that capacity needed somewhere to go. It went into bags, bags of nitrogen, bags of phosphorus, bags of potassium, bags marketed directly to every home gardener in America and across most of Europe through advertisements and magazines, on the new medium of television, in the back pages of seed catalogs, and in pamphlets handed out for free at every county fair. The message was simple, repeated relentlessly for almost 2 full decades. Real gardening required science. Science came in a bag. Real gardeners bought what was in the bag. Old gardeners, the ones who still buried stones and saved seeds and made their own compost, were quietly described as charming, as quaint, as relics of a slower and less productive age. A stone in the corner of a garden did not fit that message. A stone could not be branded. A stone could not be sold every season. A stone did not generate a recurring purchase from the same customer year after year. A stone, simply by existing in the soil and doing its quiet work, made the entire fertilizer aisle look unnecessary. So, slowly, gently, without any single decision being made by any single person, in any single boardroom, on any single afternoon, the stone was forgotten. It was not banned. It was not destroyed. It was simply left out of the story we told ourselves about how a garden was supposed to be fed. By 1960, the practice was missing from almost every American gardening textbook. By 1970, it was missing from almost every European one. By 1980, an entire generation of new gardeners had grown up never having heard the words. The stone was still in the ground, in millions of old gardens belonging to grandmothers and Amish farmers and Italian widows. But the knowledge of how to put a new one in had quietly slipped out of the common memory of the modern world. There is one thing the stone does that no synthetic fertilizer in any bag has ever been able to match. It does not wash away. When you spread a powdered chemical fertilizer on the surface of a garden, the very first heavy rain that falls on that garden carries between 30 and 60% of what you applied straight down past the root zone into the groundwater beneath your property and away from the plants you wanted to feed. Within a few weeks, you have to apply it again. Within a single growing season, you have spent more than you originally planned. Within a lifetime of gardening, you have moved hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars from your hand into a bag, from the bag into the soil, and from the soil out into the nearest creek or river or aquifer, where it does no good for anyone and slow harm to almost everything. The garden has needed you, every step of the way, every season, every year, forever. The stone does not wash away. The rain that touches the stone lifts only the smallest possible amount of mineral, just enough for the plants nearby to absorb. The rest of the stone stays exactly where you put it. The plants take what they need. The earth keeps the rest. There is no waste. There is no runoff. There is no quarterly bill arriving from the garden center. The stone is patient. The stone does not need you to remember it. And that is why, in a world that was rebuilt after 1945 around the principle of selling people things they would have to keep buying for the rest of their lives, the stone became inconvenient. Now, if you have stayed with me this far, you are probably wondering how to do this in your own garden. So let me tell you, simply, the way Luce's grandfather would have told you, and the way Daniel Stoltzfoss's great-grandfather wrote it down in a small leather notebook in 1894. You will need one stone. The best stones come from basalt formations, which exist in almost every state in the United States and almost every country in the world. Basalt is a dark, dense volcanic rock that you can often find along the edges of old roads, in dry creek beds, or in the gravel piles outside any quarry that produces crushed stone for construction. If you cannot find a piece of raw basalt within a short drive of your home, you can buy a small bag of basalt rock dust or azomite from any organic gardening supply company for under $10. A single $10 bag will give you enough material to bury under several garden beds with plenty left over. A single fist-sized piece of solid basalt, buried whole, will feed one 4-foot by 4-foot garden bed for between 8 and 12 years. A small handful of basalt rock dust mixed into the same bed at the same depth will do approximately the same job over the same length of time. The Amish prefer the whole stone because it lasts longer. The Italians prefer the dust because it acts faster. Both methods work. Both have been working for centuries. Dig down approximately 8 inches in the center of your garden bed. Place the stone or sprinkle the rock dust into the bottom of the hole. Cover it with the soil you removed. Plant whatever you would normally plant on top of it. That is the entire process. You do not need to dig it back up. You do not need to add anything to it later. You do not need to water it specially or treat it differently than the rest of your soil. The stone will quietly do its work without any further attention from you, year after year, in exactly the same way it has done for the gardens of the Sumerians and the Romans and the Andean potato farmers and the Italian grandmothers and the Amish bishops who never put a single bag of synthetic fertilizer on their soil for as long as their families have been farming. 10 years from now, when the garden bed begins to feel a little tired, when the tomatoes are not quite as tall as they used to be, when the leaves of the zucchini begin to look a little smaller than you remember, you can dig in another stone. Or you can simply leave the first one where it is and let it keep working, because what is left of it will still be releasing its slow stream of minerals for many years after you are gone. There is something about the stone that I want you to think about for a moment, even after this video ends. We were not robbed of the stone. We were not forced to forget it. No one came to our gardens at night and dug it out of the ground. No agency made it illegal. No corporation issued a recall. No law was passed against the practice in any state, in any country, anywhere in the world. We simply walked past it, season after season, on our way to buy something newer and louder and more expensive. That is how knowledge dies in the modern world. Not through violence, through neglect. through the slow, almost invisible substitution of something that needs us for something that did not. The stone in the corner of Lucia's garden has been doing the same job, in the same place, for the 78 years since her grandfather buried it, the year his oldest son came home from the war. It has outlived 3 popes, 4 wars, 11 Italian prime ministers, and every single brand of synthetic fertilizer that has ever been advertised on television. It will outlive me. It will outlive you. And one day, if someone is fortunate enough to be told about it the way I was told about it, by a woman in a faded blue apron in a garden in the mountains of central Italy, it will quietly outlive them too. The stone is still there. The knowledge is still there. The 4,000-year-old practice is still there. It was never lost. It was only set down. If something in this stirred you, if you felt for even a moment that you had heard about this once before in some old story your grandmother tried to tell, you on a long afternoon, when you were too young or too distracted to listen properly, then you are not alone. Thousands of people who have watched the videos on this channel have written to say the same exact thing. The forgetting was wide. The remembering is slow. But it has begun. In the next video on this channel, I am going to show you another thing the old gardens knew. Something even simpler than the stone. Something that lived in almost every farmhouse kitchen for 200 years before someone, somewhere, quietly decided we did not need it anymore. If you want to find that video when it goes up, the subscribe button is right below this one. That is the only thing I will ask of you today. The stone will keep working whether you remember it or not. But the gardens that need it most are the ones we are still planting this spring, in whatever small corner of the world we have managed to keep for ourselves. Until next time,